This is Jay Frost speaking to you, of course, from the desk at Frontlines of Social Good, our new program, bringing you the latest stories shaping the nonprofit and philanthropic sectors. We have some stories for you and then two great guest interviews. So stick with us, would you? First of all, as you know, there are some major wildfire relief efforts going on in California right now. In response to those wildfires, philanthropy is stepping up in a pretty major way. Beyonce's Bay Good Foundation has pledged $2.5 million to the LA Fire Relief Fund to aid residents in Altadena and Pasadena who have lost homes. And these funds will also support churches and community centers addressing the immediate needs of those affected. Other celebrities in the news for their support include Jamie Lee Curtis and Christopher Guest, who pledged $1 million, Eva Longoria, who has promised to match up to $50,000 in donations to This Is About Humanity, and Metallica's All Within My Hands Foundation, which has donated $500,000 to the American Red Cross and other local organizations, according to Riff Magazine. Corporate contributions have been significant as well, with Disney pledging $15 million, Walmart $2.5 million, and Kroger pledging an additional $1 million. Verizon is also stepping in, donating $1 million to the American Red Cross, and the NFL has committed $5 million to relief efforts. Airbnb is doing its part as well, providing free temporary housing to displaced residents. Meanwhile, in other philanthropy news, Mackenzie Scott has continued her record-breaking donations, donating a total of over $2 billion in 2024, bringing her total giving to approximately $19.2 billion since 2019, when she made many of those major contributions and began recording them on her site. Among the recent beneficiaries is Minnesota's nonprofit CAAL, which CBS Minnesota reports has received $5 million to support its work with immigrant and refugee communities, and drawing attention from many across the political landscape. In Greensboro, North Carolina, Cone Health News states that Cone Health has received an historic $75 million donation from an anonymous donor, making it the single largest gift in its history. Funds will expand healthcare services and address critical regional health disparities. Another major story, which I'm sure you've heard a bit about, is former President Jimmy Carter, who passed away recently at the age of 100. Former President Carter and his wife, First Lady Rosalind Carter, left behind a powerful legacy of giving that continues to resonate for many of us. Their nearly 40 years of post-presidency service has shaped millions of lives, from affordable housing to global health and caregiving advocacy. Their partnership with Habitat for Humanity, for example, was one of the most visible contributions, where since 1984, the Carters helped build and refurbish homes in 14 countries through the Carter Work Project. Habitat for Humanity CEO Jonathan Reckford recalls Carter's tireless work ethic on construction sites, saying, "It's not a competition as long as this house gets finished first." They've worked in over 70 countries, contributing over 900,000 volunteers in 2023 alone at Habitat. Beyond housing, the Carters championed democracy and global health through the Carter Center, established in 1982. Over the last 4 decades, the center monitored elections in 40 countries and worked to eradicate diseases like guinea worm. Thanks to funding that included over $290 million from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation since 2000, cases of guinea worm disease have fallen from 3.5 million in 1986 to just 14 cases last year. Carter, who won the Nobel Prize in 2002 for his human rights work, had hoped to outlive the disease. He nearly did. Rosalind Carter's advocacy for caregivers also leaves a lasting mark. She founded the Rosalind Carter Institute for Caregivers, supporting people who care for loved ones. Last month, philanthropist Melinda French Gates pledged to match up to $500,000 in donations to the Institute for Giving Tuesday, raising $253,000 to further its mission. Jimmy Carter once again died on December 29th at the age of 100. He was predeceased by his wife, Rosalind Carter, in November of 2023 at the age of 96. There have been a number of other major grant announcements, including the Lilly Endowment committing $95 million to 20 organizations supporting Christian churches in rural areas and small towns, the McCaslin Foundation awarding $10 million to the University of Oklahoma to construct new residence halls for first-year students, and the Leader for Change Trust in American Institutions Challenge, which provides $10 million to restore public trust in institutions like schools, government bodies, and the media. Now, in terms of coming challenges for the nonprofit sector, which is a great segue for our first guest, the challenges facing the sector are rapidly escalating with far-reaching implications for civil society. Conservative lawmakers, for example, joined by many in the Democratic aisle, are proposing sweeping changes that could fundamentally disrupt how nonprofits operate. According to the Chronicle of Philanthropy, these proposals have included limiting foreign donations, imposing higher taxes on university endowments, and subjecting organizations to stricter oversight, particularly those involved in election-related activities. Mark Berkowitz, executive director of the Democracy Funders Network, warns that the re-election of Donald Trump has placed the nonprofit sector in its most precarious position in decades. President Trump recently accused nonprofits of, quote, getting away with spending all of their time and money on getting Donald Trump, and further said, we are watching these thugs and sleazebags closely. This rhetoric, combined with potential legislative actions and targeted investigations, has created a climate of some concern for organizations advocating for LGBTQ rights, voter engagement, reproductive rights, and environmental causes. The risk of increased scrutiny, legal challenges, and coordinated efforts to discredit the work is higher than ever. Nonprofits now face difficult questions. How do they protect their missions, their constituents, and their donors from being targeted? How can they continue to operate effectively under the weight of this growing oversight? To help us unpack some of these risks and explore potential solutions, we're joined by Tracy Kronzak, Chief Strategy Officer at Benevolent Tech, and author of a powerful piece called The Next 4 Years, a Nonprofit Survival Guide. Tracy brings a unique perspective shaped by years of experience in nonprofit tech and community organizing during moments of crisis. Tracy, welcome to the program. Great to have you here.
Hey, thank you. And thank you so much for having me. It's actually an honor to be here, and I'm a great admirer of your work, and I'm a great admirer of the missions that everyone here supports.
Well, and Tracy, I have to say, first of all, thank you for that. But the piece that you wrote, I think, really drew a fine point on some of the issues that we're all facing right now. But it's something you're not a stranger to, which is maybe what prepared you to write something like that. Can you just take us back a little bit about how you drew from maybe your personal experience with, I think, the AIDS crisis and post-Soviet work, and how that helped you to shape what you ended up drafting and posting to LinkedIn?
Sure. I'll preface it with the caveat that everybody is saying right now, and that is, I want to be wrong about all of this. I want to be whole scale and categorically wrong, and not just a little bit wrong, a lot of it wrong. But I came up in a very fraught time in American politics. I personally identify as a multiple flag flying member of the LGBT communities. And I grew up in a very conservative state during a very conservative time in the United States. So, if you look at the tensions politically and socially of what was happening in the 1980s and into the early 1990s, when I entered into college, there was an enormous backlash against the LGBT movements for essentially standing up and saying AIDS was a crisis. And that matriculated throughout the 1990s in ways that ultimately the very far right of this country picked up and leveraged as scapegoating moments for LGBT folks. And during the course of my collegiate career, I also was studying post-Soviet transitions at that time, from centralized economies and centralized political systems to free market capitalism and some form of democratization. So these two pillars of my life had the moment to unify when I won a scholarship to travel to Russia to begin documenting what was it that LGBT folks were doing to advance their own cause, but also protect themselves in post-Soviet Russia, which at the time in 1993, I spent multiple months there during the summertime. I left town, I think, about a week and a half, maybe 2 weeks before the second coup attempt. There's a lot of stories there. Folks will always say when Tracy says back in Russia, but the folks who actually believe me are the Russians, who were like, "What were you doing there and why?" And I came back summer '94 to do more of the same. And those movements were very reflective of how organizing and social contact took place in the 60s and 70s amongst the LGBT folks who, you had to know somebody. And it was very trust driven, it was very decentralized, and folks were very concerned about what the state, in this case, the United States, but then Russia, was going to clamp down on regarding their freedom of association and regarding their freedom of assembly. So those were the parallels I was seeing back in that era, both of which I drew upon to put into the piece that I posted on LinkedIn.
So, can you talk a bit about the challenges that you think, the specific challenges that we are imagining or you perceive in our sector here? I mean, how much of that you saw in a place like Russia do you imagine is really the risk for us?
Well, I think you started talking about it even in your introduction to this segment when, you mentioned all of the groups that were being potentially scapegoated by the incoming administration. And what I would say is that creates an urgency crisis for every single one of those communities. But scapegoating is a symptom, not a cause. And what I mean by that is that if you look at how authoritarian governments establish control, it is about the creation of precedent. And it is easiest to create precedent for future actions when you have a community to scapegoat. So the easy outliers right now, based on the Trump campaign, were LGBT communities and immigrants. But the fallacy of that is thinking that once the precedent for scapegoating those communities has been established and laws, policies, directives, executive orders, legislative action has been created to, somehow compartmentalize those groups, the fallacy is that it's going to stop with them. Precedent allows for the creation of more precedent. And that is what happened in Russia in a very direct way in the 1990s, where one of the articles that criminalized homosexuality as a category was overturned. Movements started forming. And what we saw in reaction to that first was we don't want LGBT folks to assemble. Then we don't want them to be talked about in school. Then we don't want them to display any affection towards each other. And each time those precedents built on each other, and then ultimately Vladimir Putin has been able to return to power by simply saying, well, the state has all of these precedents for control. Let's start applying them elsewhere. That's the threat that I see in the Trump administration incoming. And I think the thing that I also learned was when somebody says, "This is what I want to do," it's not rhetoric, it's real. And I think the way that Trump broadcasts this makes people think like he's just blustering. But if you take this at face value, which is what I encourage everyone to do, he has said quite directly, "I want to be a dictator on day one." And my experience in politics analysis and policy tells me that's all you actually need. You don't need a day two if you've created that precedent on day one. So we're in a moment where we get to rethink everything about how we operate, both as movements, as philanthropists, and as impact organizations.
Let's talk about that a little bit. Organizations are conducting a range of activities. We've got so many now, well over 1 million, as you know. And what are the specific risks that organizations across that spectrum of activity might need to be wary about or mindful of, especially on things that you've mentioned in your piece, like data, donors, and staffing?
Sure. I mean, taking it from 100,000 feet up, when you start eroding what are considered to be legislative or democratic safeguards on the operation of people or organizations, then that slippery slope that gets created means every subsequent action does not look as radical. So if you take that down to how organizations present themselves, what this means is that the ordinary protections of things like, the 14th Amendment or ordinary non-discrimination protections, or even the protections that their data and technology that they've invested into major corporate platforms can be eroded and examined by the state. So, what we're looking at is a range of surveillance based activities coupled with that very outward scapegoating. And when you bring those two together, it imperils these organizations from action because they're either so responding to the scapegoating that they forget that they are being potentially surveilled by the state, or they're so responding to the state that the, you know, actual scapegoating takes hold. And I think those things are the things that I was thinking about when I wrote the piece because I said, okay, what did I learn? Well, learn how to hide, learn how to decentralize, learn how to create trusted decentralized networks, learn how to determine what of the information your organization keeps on file and where is actually valuable to your operation, and learn what is nice to have but you don't need, because I could very readily see, a lens of light now being also shined on donors to these now suspect, and I do put that in quotes, organizations. So if you look at, like, for example, the rights fascination with somebody like George Soros, what is to stop that now from being applied to Ford Foundation? What is to stop that from being applied to me as a simple donor to an organization? That initial erosion of those boundaries is what establishes the precedent for those things to now create targeted efforts to all.
You talked about decentralized information, trusting those those networks as a way of, I guess, protecting the people that the organizations serve, as well as the donor communities that support them. And I'm wondering if you can draw that out a bit and help us to understand what that looks like in reality. Are there examples today where organizations have been protective of data? They've been compliant, of course, with the laws and open about the work that they do, but they've been able to protect their community of trust?
Well, I actually haven't looked into it much in recent years, but what I can say is what it looked like in the old days was we were very dependent on paper files. So it went down to the physical safety of those paper files. And in some cases, I was even asked very recently by someone in the tech industry, hey, Tracy, should these organizations get out of cloud tools and go back to on-premise storage for their most sensitive data and their most sensitive constituent information? So that is the kind of question that I think we should start asking ourselves, because the promise of cloud platforms was your server will never crash, and that sort of created a siren song of now we can distribute data wide scale. And we're in a moment where we have to start thinking about, is that wide scale distribution of data still serving us, or do we need to narrow the parameters of the data that we collect and potentially take some of it away from those tools? Because those tools can be subpoenaed. Those businesses are not there to protect nonprofits, they're there to protect their bottom line. And many, many, many tech leaders, some of whom I deeply admired through the years, have come out either in literal support of the Trump administration or in passive support of the Trump administration. So I would say begin by asking your organization at the ground level, when you open up your CRM, when you open up your data warehouse, when you open up, your documents online, what do we have there that if it were to get into the hands of a state that is subpoenaing that information and wanting to use it against me in a court of law, or a poor actor, meaning a hacker, someone who's gotten into your system, what damage could it do? And to whom? And why? And I think that's the starting point now in the digital era, just like in the paper era. we never kept file. When I was a student activist, we never kept files in the student, assembly hall. We had a tiny little office there. We never kept files there because everyone in the university had a key. We always kept them someplace else. And I think it's a mentality shift, is what I'm pointing at, because this kind of thinking is new for us in the United States.
What do you say to organizations and organizational leaders who say, "Well, this may be concerning, but I'm not in that kind of work. I'm over here. I'm running this little whatever it is, social service organization, or
Mhm.
it's a community arts center, and this is important, sure, but it doesn't really impact me."
I would say, congratulations. You and your organization are now on the front lines of helping protect those most vulnerable and affected by this. Because the distinction that you're drawing, Jay, is an important one, and that is there are the immediately targeted folks, and then there are folks who are not being immediately targeted. And it is no surprise to me that the immediately targeted folks are on the front lines of the new culture wars that have been ignited. And you don't see JDRF, being called out by an incoming president. You don't see tiny little food banks being called out by the incoming president. So, what those organizations have to offer is, look, we know that from the lens of the current thinking, we're fairly non-controversial, but I guarantee you that your constituents, no matter how you perceive them, some percentage of them overlap with these organizations that are being targeted. Start finding out and calling around and asking how you can help. Can you help by offering legal support? Can you help by re-granting dollars? Can you help by leveraging your maybe technology and expertise, which would be a league ahead of a small organization? So, it is true that there is a bucket of non-controversial organizations right now, but this is a moment where I think the entire impact industry in the United States should be thinking about how to come together and protect itself. And for organization leaders that are in non-controversial organizations, I would say start asking the organizations around you what you can do. Um, and that will stretch both your thinking about your own mission, but it will also hopefully pull you out of your comfort zone, which is a good thing right now.
There are a lot of risks that you and others have been talking about, but are there signs of resilience or strength that you see could be built on as a result of all these challenges?
100%. I mean, I am at heart an academic and a nerd, and there is some great thinking out there that is being put forth by some of the authors that I was even reading on, my last reading list from 2024. I always call her out now because I found this work fundamental, but Ellie Reeves' book, Black Pill, tells you directly and in no uncertain terms how we got here. And then if you look at something like, oh gosh, I just dropped on her name. The name of the book is Mutualism, and it is written by, gonna pull this right up because yay, internet. Here it is, Sarah Horowitz. She talks a lot about the future shape of government, helping to enable collaborations of people to do what they do best for each other, right? So we have some academic thinkers that are giving us roadmaps and new ideas. And then, if you couple that with rethinking about how we distribute money, like I don't think it's a coincidence that the state of California is setting aside a huge chunk of its budget surplus for legal defense. We need to think about that as a coherent strategy. And I also see, what I hesitate to use the term because it's weighted, but it is true, resistance starting to form all over the place. And the moment will necessitate us connecting on the ground thinkers who have 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 bullet points of genuine experience with organizations that can start assembling that thinking and putting it into a coherent action plan across the impact economy in the United States. So yes, I'm absolutely seeing it. Right now, it's popping up as individual thinking and individual action, but watching even those connections form on a network as banal as LinkedIn has been heartening because people are aware this is a moment. We just it's not an unprecedented moment. It's just not one we've lived through yet in the United States. It has plenty of precedent in other countries.
So if you could leave nonprofit leaders with one piece of advice for navigating this, what would it be?
I would say think differently about how you formulate your partnerships with your constituents, with your funders, and with other organizations. I've been around the nonprofit world a very long time. And I know, believe me, I know there are grievances, grudges, funding systems, bureaucracies. And I think those things over time can sometimes take hold of an organization's operation in an anti-strategic manner. So the best bit of advice I was ever given was by one of my former bosses that said, Tracy, strategy has no ego. And if we can divest ourselves from whatever we think our shared past or our shared conflicts were, and work on finding common solutions together. Just pick up the phone and say, "So this is who I am. How can we help each other now?" Is as good a starting point as any. Because I came out of business partnerships in the tech industry, and the only way you get a partnership is if you get two people or more in the same room talking. And I think that is where I would say to begin. And don't be afraid. Um, it's now is there's enough fear in the air for us all. Be confident in who you are and what your organization does. And, when I walk into a room, I carry for myself personally all the doubt and fear that someone coming out of, LGBT movements, having experienced a lot of traumatic events in my life carries. So I have to take a moment and I say, okay, breathe. You're not here for that. You're here for this forward looking thing. So now's the time to start thinking very differently about how we move forward.
Thank you so much, Tracy. Tracy is, of course, once again, the Chief Strategy Officer of Benevolent Tech and wrote that piece, which you'll find on LinkedIn, called The Next 4 Years, a Nonprofit Survival Guide. You can look up Tracy's profile there and see a copy of that. Thank you so much, Tracy. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone. Agree or disagree, let's start some dialogue.
Thank you, Tracy.
Thank you.
And now we're going to bring on board, of course, our author of the week. As you know, we wanted to make sure we started covering all the various authors who are in this sector. And some of those you've seen on my shelf or have appeared in past episodes of the Mastermind series. And this week, we're very happy to have with us David Rode. David is a nonprofit executive coach, strategic consultant, and founder of .org. He teaches graduate courses on nonprofit branding as an adjunct professor at the University of Pennsylvania and serves as deputy director for PenPAC, holds a business degree from Georgetown, an MBA from Wharton, and studied at Oxford as well. His first book, which I'm holding right here, came out just this fall, and it's Passion Isn't Enough, a practical guide for nonprofit leaders. So it's a pleasure to have on board today, David Rode. David, thank you so much for hanging out today.
Jay, it's an absolute pleasure. Looking forward to the conversation.
It's really great to have you. Thank you so much, first of all, for the copy of the book. Others should definitely buy it. I was lucky to get a copy from you. And there's a lot to unpack in here. And a colleague of ours in this world, Nathan Chappelle, talked about, among many things, its practicality. And I have to echo that. It's very much an action guide. And I have a lot to ask you about it, but maybe the first and most important question is, why did you write it? What inspired it?
Well, it's an important question. Through my conversations over the years, I've been in the sector for 20 plus years, and many times talking to people that were looking to start organizations or people who had recently started organizations. And then as I moved more into the consulting space and focused more on CEO mentoring and coaching, what I found is I was hearing the same themes, the same challenges over and over again, regardless of what part of the nonprofit sector people were in, regardless of where they were geographically, and even to a certain degree, regardless of their budget size. So to me, what I found is that my solutions were being really well received. My guidance was working, and there's only so many people you can help in one-on-one conversations. So it felt to me that one way to scale some of this wisdom was to put it into a book. And I not only was able to put in my experience, but I interviewed 22 different nonprofit CEOs and subject matter experts, and their best practices and their wisdom is throughout the book. So I really feel like it is meant to be an actionable, results-oriented, very accessible resource for nonprofit leaders.
You have something right at the very top in the introduction, which I loved. It's a story about Pitch In, which is an organization. I didn't put that in the bio that I read, but I think it's a powerful story because it's not just about baseball, as much as we may love baseball. It's also about the organization's impact and what happened with you at that organization, what it helped you to learn and now to apply. Can you share a little bit of that story here?
Sure. I founded an organization called Pitch In for Baseball and Softball. Coincidentally, it was started right at the time-wise, right when Hurricane Katrina hit the Gulf Coast region, and we grew from a really small organization with an idea of helping kids get the equipment they needed to play baseball and softball, and scaled through partnerships all over the United States and all over the world. So it was a great opportunity for me to learn on the job. But I was new to the nonprofit sector. I had a lot of confidence in myself as a leader. But leading this organization was a little bit of a case of I didn't know what I didn't know. I got a lot of things right, many things wrong, and I learned from it, and I became a better leader over time. And then my guidance to others became more pinpointed over time, because I realized there were right and wrong ways to approach strategic planning and board development and fundraising and communications and all these things. So that experience was invaluable to me to be in the front row, and I loved my time with the organization. I loved the kinds of things we were able to do, not just generally helping people, but helping communities recover from natural disasters when fire or a flood or something would wipe out the equipment room of a given youth baseball or softball program. So it was a great ride, a great experience.
There's also another story later in there about baseball, which I'm going to get to later because I think it's instructive for those in capital campaigns. But I do want to take apart a bit about what you just described. You have chapters that are all about building, and you start with building a strategic plan. That might seem obvious to some, but not to others, because I've seen many organizations where they don't have one. So will you talk about why that's important as a first chapter, maybe as a first step, and maybe how people can go about it?
Well, you can't know where you're trying to go if you don't have clear direction and goals. And so the purpose of a strategic plan in simple terms is it's a roadmap for the organization. Here's where we are now. Here's where we'd like to be in a certain period of time. Let's say 3 years. And we have limited resources. We don't have enough people. We don't have enough money. So we can't do everything. And so you're forced to make decisions. What are we going to put our energies against? And what are we going to say? That's a good idea, but we're going to hold off on that for now. And so strategic planning allows you to bring together staff and board leadership to kind of create a unified vision for where you want to go. You're making a bet on yourself. You're making a bet on the organization. If we focus on A, B, and C, we're going to be way better off, however we define way better off, than we would be if we just kind of open the doors every day and see what happened. And so there's a natural instinct to just sort of react to our email inbox and focus on our programming and keep our heads down. But as a leader of an organization, we have to make certain decisions about how do we think we can, if growth is the objective, how can we grow most efficiently and most effectively? Where are our weaknesses? Where do we need to shore up our organization so that we can be stronger? And what are the opportunities we can pursue so that we can grow in a way that's going to be really enable us to achieve the impact we're hoping to have against whatever target community we are hoping to serve? So a strategic plan is fundamental. It really is about disciplined thinking and trying to make sure you understand where you're going to spend those marginal dollars and your time to try to make a difference for the organization.
You said in there that if growth is the objective or the goal, can you talk about that a little bit?
Right. I think there's a lot of times pressure to scale. And I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing for every organization, but it may not be for every organization at every moment in time. I think you have to understand where you're at in your trajectory as an organization. Do you have the infrastructure to support growth? Have you figured out all of your programs already? Do you have a measurement and evaluation system in place? How is your board structured? If you want to grow and become a national organization, but you're currently only local, well, does your board, share that, mirror that direction in some way that's going to support that growth? So a lot of things go into thinking about the decision to grow and growing in a measured way. More is not always better. Sometimes more is better. Sometimes, that's an instinct, but I don't think it's necessarily, it's also sometimes a distraction. And we can find ourselves being spread too thin, and then we're putting all of our attention on where we're trying to grow, and we lose sight of what made us good or helpful in the first place. And now all of a sudden we're not really serving anybody the way we intended, but we're kind of growing and supporting more people. So maybe that's good. But I think it really requires a lot of discipline between the board and the staff to kind of come up with a plan that is sort of right-sized for each organization.
In fact, I was going to ask you about the board. You do have a chapter, as one should in any book like this, about the board. And you talked about the board that is active, engaged, responsive, generous, and committed. That's a lot. It's not the old saw. I know you get into the issue about fundraising from a board in the book, but it's a more expansive, inclusive kind of way of thinking about the board's involvement. Can you talk about why choose those adjectives, but also how do you get there? Active, engaged, responsive, generous, and committed.
I mean, if we've been in board meetings where you have sort of the opposite, you have an agenda, maybe you're the leader, you're starting and you're talking and you get crickets in terms of a response from your board, then that's not a great moment. It's not a great feeling. You want board members to participate and help shape the direction of the organization. And to me, the key is, where does that conversation with the board members start? And it starts when you recruit them. It starts when you vet them. And so I identify, and I believe it's important to have roles and expectations and have a very open conversation with prospective board members in advance of them joining your board. This is what being on this board is going to look and feel like. This is what's expected of you in terms of time, in terms of preparation, in terms of reaching into your network, in terms of fundraising, either individually or sort of, crowdsourcing, however that's going to look and feel for you. But making sure that they understand what being on a board is all about. Many times people want to join a board for the right reasons. They want to advance things. There may be some other people that like, it's good cocktail party conversation. Oh, I'm on the board of X and Y and Z organization. And that's fine, except are they committed? Are they holding up their end of the deal? It's a very important responsibility being on a board. And I think we should, navigate that carefully. We should not give out seats willy-nilly at the beginning. Somebody's like, oh, I'd love to join your board. And like, oh, great, we'd love to have you. And then 3 and 6 months into the their board service, then they start realizing what they got themselves into. Now you've got dead wood who's not doing the things you need. And then you have to have a very uncomfortable conversation about how they're going to need to either move off the board or dramatically change their behavior. So I think it's important to have adult conversations up front about board service, and then each year, evaluate how a board member is doing. Say, we talked about doing these 5 things: naming, prospective board members, reaching into your network, coming to our events, fundraising to a certain level, whatever that means for your organization. And it's a scorecard, and it's not meant to just make people feel bad, but it's also holding people accountable in a reasonable way for a very important job within your organization. So I think board service is critical. You're never going to bat 100% in terms of who your board members are, but you always want to have as many people kind of rowing in the same direction with the same amount of effort as possible. And I think it starts up front.
And just to follow up on that, one of the discussions about boards and fundraising, and for that matter, the definition of what the board member is to do, that job description, often seems fixed if it exists at all. How evolutionary should it be? In other words, what if a person joins the board and then they actually do go through the evaluation like you just suggested? That's terrific. One would think, though, that the organization is constantly changing. They might be doing new programs, they might be trying to grow, or they might be trying to, change in some way, have a new collaboration. And that would all impact the role of both staff and board members. So how flexible do we need to be with people once they've joined us, whether at the staff level, but particularly the board level?
Sure. I think the expectations that I'm looking at are a little bit more general, and maybe less programmatic in nature. So I think they'd be less subject to the way an organization meets and how that would change at the margins for a board member. But certainly, everything should be looked at on some kind of an annual basis. If you have a governance committee or a nominating committee or whatever, they should be looking at those roles and expectations, and they should be tweaking them to make sure that that they are really matching and mirroring what the organization is all about and what it's hoping for going forward. So I think anything, whether it's reviewing bylaws, reviewing board expectations, or anything, just because it's set one time doesn't mean it's set forever. I think organizations should relook at their missions on some kind of a periodic basis and make sure that that is really reflecting who they are and how they want to be and how they want to show up for their community. So, and many times an organization's mission or other things were written many iterations of the board ago. And so you could have a board who almost no one played a role in crafting those things, yet they've inherited them. So I think having a fresh set of eyes on those things is reasonable. And I think it's healthy to make sure people continually remind themselves and buy back into what the organization stands for.
I gave you a suggestion. I was going to talk about this, so I want to make sure I ask you about it. And that's the example of a capital campaign. It is one of the biggest opportunities, but stressors on many organizations. And I know you could probably just talk about that for a few hours, but you have a really salient example of how things can go well in the book. This example of Alan Horowitz as a successful major gift cultivation for a capital campaign. It seems like one that's not just about getting the money. It's about building the relationship of trust and then making it successful for the donor and for the organization. Can you share a little bit of that and maybe what the key learning is for people as they think about that?
Sure. Kenny Holdsman is one of the CEOs that I interviewed in creating the book project. Kenny is a brilliant leader of an organization called Philadelphia Youth Basketball, and they had a capital project to build community center, 100,000 square foot community center was going to run, $25+ million. And they were early days in their campaign, and they had like $2 or $3 million. And so they were making progress, but it just so happened that there was a tragedy within their organization. One of their coaches was killed, and so one day somebody asked Kenny, "How are you doing?" And he kind of honestly said, "I'm doing terrible," and shares this story. And the person says, "Hold on a minute," and he reached out and contacted somebody who ended up changing the sort of the direction of the organization a little bit. And that person was Alan Horowitz. And Alan Horowitz was a very successful businessman, but also was a huge basketball fan. He's sort of like known within the community as the sixth man. His seats are courtside for Philadelphia 76ers games right next to the bench. So he's very visible within the community. And the takeaway was Alan ended up making a meaningful leadership gift to the organization. Not because he had the means, because there's a lot of wealth in our country and people don't give their money away willy-nilly. People give because they feel a connection. There's an emotional connection that they have. They can see themselves in the organization and they can understand and relate to what the organization is trying to accomplish. It ends up that Alan lost his father at roughly the same age that this boy lost his father, who was a coach. And so the relationship grew. Alan made a leadership gift, and his leadership gift was such an important signal to the rest of the community that, hey, this is a meaningful, worthwhile capital campaign. And it ended up sort of reducing the risk for other major donors, because when they saw his name at the top, then they knew that it had been properly vetted. So the answer, the big takeaway is people give not because they can, but because they want to. And I think we have to work on understanding who people are, what their motivations are, what their stories are. And if once we have that connection and that relationship, then we can move into major gift territory at some point. And so that was my takeaway from Kenny's sharing that story with me, and that's why I placed it in the book.
Thank you for that. I think it's a great story, and it should inspire people as they think about how to build these relationships once they've found people with a passion for our projects. You have a whole bunch of builds in here, each chapter. Which is the toughest of these, do you think, for the organizations that are picking this up? Maybe what's been the toughest for you?
In my experience, the toughest is building your measurement and evaluation program. I think organizations understand the importance of demonstrating their impact, but most nonprofit organizations, I think 92% is the number that I've found through my research, have budgets of $1 million or fewer here in the United States. So they really don't have a lot of resources. They don't have a lot of staff. And so the idea of being able to measure and stay on top of impact is really a challenge. We know, however, that for institutional funders, for grant makers, demonstrating impact, not just anecdotally or with testimonials, but with some kind of data is critical. We know that other partners and other donors really respond very favorably to understanding the impact that you're having. You might have a nice organization that has a wonderful idea, but there's only so much money to go around, and how are organizations going to make that critical decision about who to fund and who not to fund? And so I think the challenge that I've seen the most through my coaching experience is trying to create a program within an organization that they feel like they can manage given their resources, that's going to get to the bottom of or begin to shine light on the impact that they are having. And frankly, it's a huge challenge, but it is our responsibility as leaders to say, okay, this is our theory of change. This is the kind of change we're hoping to have. How can we begin to demonstrate and answer the question, do you know your programs are working? And I think we have an obligation to do that. It's not perfect science. We're not talking about, randomized studies here. We're talking about a cohort of people that you're measuring before and after they've gone through your program and being able to show some kind of a meaningful difference. And I think we can do that if we really put our minds to it. But I would say that's one of the biggest challenges that I've seen in the sector and with the nonprofits that I've been involved with.
And there are a couple of other builds in there which I think are particularly important for many organizations, and especially right now. One is about building your diverse organization. Now, I know you only released the book in the fall, but we've already seen this explosion of conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Lots of different things are being said about DEI programs at the corporate level. We've just seen Apple take one tack versus McDonald's taking another. Lots of things are happening on that front. And I'm wondering if you can talk about whether or not that discussion is particularly important now and how important it will be in the future to organizations that are seeing these signals and wondering, well, what are we, a little nonprofit, supposed to do if McDonald's and Apple are going these other directions?
Right. Well, the first thing is, I think we can get easily distracted by organizations that have sort of no relationship or bearing on who we are. Multi-billion-dollar multinational corporations that are publicly held are not who we are. We are typically working in a community. And I think at the center of any DEI conversation is, does our organization reflect the community we are trying to serve? And to what degree does it do so? So I think diversity could take many shapes and forms within an organization. It can be thought about from a staff level. It can be thought about from a volunteer basis. It can be thought about from how are we dealing with our materials and our communications available in multiple languages? What is the shape and construction of our board of directors? And that's where it shows up in many situations. And, there's conversations that, a nonprofit CEO is given the directive, we need to be more diverse. It's like, okay, what does that exactly mean? Are we going to be a token organization? Are we going to bring one person in to represent all of this other, group of people that are not being represented? That feels to me to be very disingenuous. So I think, there's not a destination when it comes to being a more diverse organization. I think it makes sure that we have to look at everything we do through a reasonable lens and say, are we giving people, is there equity and inclusion? How open are we? If we're just looking for people within our own networks and we all happen to look like me, as an example, then maybe we are not going to reach into parts of the community that don't look like me. And so we have to be very intentional about how we are attracting, whether it's new staff, new board, et cetera, to make sure that we are really, creating dynamic and robust pools of candidates and trying to find the best people to make sure that our organization is reflective of the communities we serve. So I don't think we need to model ourselves and be distracted by major corporations. I think we need to understand, what does it look and feel like for our organization, and try to hold ourselves to whatever standard we feel is appropriate.
Thank you for that. I also want to ask you about one that's a personal favorite, which is a discussion of exit strategies, maybe as a concluding question, because we all know organizations that have founders that have passion, to borrow from your book title, and maybe they have the skills too, but sometimes it's hard to let go. I mean, this happens in all different parts of society, from families to companies to nonprofits. And I'm just wondering, first of all, why did you include this? Why is this important? And do you think that every organization and every organizational leader needs an exit strategy?
Well, I think every organization needs a succession plan. And so, what would, if I'm on a board, I should be asking the question, what are the biggest risks to our organization? What could cause us to go out of business? And that could be, we don't have enough money, we have a cash flow problem. That's sort of front and center normally. But a leadership transition could really take an organization in a very dramatic, way, and take over the viability of the future. So, if all of the relationships for partners and donors are being held by a CEO or a founder, and those aren't being sort of democratized and shared throughout the organization, then if that person gets sick, gets hit by a bus, decides this isn't for them, is caught up in a scandal, or whatever the thing may be that causes them to not be able to lead the organization, then you might be caught really flat-footed as an organization. So I think succession planning is important. And I don't think it should be, I think it should be normalized between staff leadership and the board. It's not a threat. It's not a negotiating tactic. It's just, what do we need to do to make sure the organization's going to be in safe hands? What would that plan look like? Is it somebody that's currently on the staff that could step in? Is there a particular board member that could step in? Do we need to consider interim leadership? If we're not in a position to hire a full-time person right away. So there's lots of considerations. And I think that the organization should have a plan to, reach into the desk and pull out the envelope, open this in case of emergency, kind of a thing. And there should be something there that says, this is what we're going to do. This is what our best thinking is. So I think it's important that every organization have that kind of a conversation and be ready. In the best case scenario, you don't need to act on it. But if you did need to act on it, you wouldn't be starting from, some kind of a standstill. You'd have a plan, you'd have an approach. You can share that approach with staff to reassure them that the organization is going to be fine, reassure donors, reassure others. We knew this was coming. This date was happening. We had plans in place, and here's how we're going to carry that forward, so that you don't just, exhibit this kind of panic, which could easily take over an organization if a leadership transition isn't properly planned for.
Thank you so much for this, David. Unfortunately, I didn't have a plan for how to end an interesting conversation, except to say that your book is available now. That's Passion Isn't Enough, Practical Guide for Nonprofit Leaders. And people can also find you, I know, on LinkedIn, as a place where we have talked. So thank you very much for being here today and sharing a little bit about your work.
Jay, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
And now we are going to go to a different segment, one we're introducing today, which is On the Road. We're going to be sharing with you a little bit about an organization that is doing work on the front lines of change right in the thick of the wildfires in California, the Forestry and Fire Recruitment Program, or FFRP. We're going to share a little video from them right now.
You go above and beyond. Ain't no quitting you. You really got heart. And that's what it matters for me. Push yourself. This is what we do. We firefighters.
The Forestry and Fire Recruitment Program is a nonprofit organization that's dedicated to helping the people formerly incarcerated in California's conservation camps transition into gainful employment as firefighters or as workers in the fire sector.
A lot of people are lost, like completely lost, and they don't have a support system.
And so what we decided was that we were going to be a support system for the people who didn't have supports.
And my job and what I'm focusing on is to produce quality firefighters.
This work is to make sure that folks have the physical standards needed to be a firefighter out here.
Last man got it!
The goal is to make sure you all have the certifications you all need that can be used with any different fire agency across the nation. A lot of times people say that you all don't deserve the opportunities to. A lot of times you all have personal barriers and challenges that prevent you from hopping into these spaces. But we want to show the world and show people that we deserve the opportunity to go do this work. And so we're going to do that.
Well, folks, if you'd like to have your organization featured in a future edition of this show, I hope you will contact us directly so we can either get out to see you or you can send us a video and have your work featured in our On the Road segment. Next week, we will have Brian Saber, president of Asking Matters, and Dave Raley, author of The Rise of Subscription Video. And we look forward to, of course, hearing what you want to see and hear, which you can let us know by filling out the live survey or contacting me on LinkedIn. See you next week. Thanks so much for being here.